group there last night. It must be quite impressive. I mean, I don't know people. Yeah.
Some people are recognized.
Yeah, and then the general coalition that they talked about, organizations that I didn't even realize had that much. And so I was quite impressed by that. Have lots of people write up. And then when I heard there were people who had something done to religion, or perhaps not.
I guess when God in general says,
Yeah. Now, when you say like the general, it's not the federal. It wouldn't be I don't think, maybe the provincial would, because there's a lot of provincial money, that comes to the city. So it might take interest in it. That's probably the provincial one. They have been good in the fact they cut out for us. And I was with the Ontario Waste Corporation. The first year, they descended upon us, my boss, and the board that came on wise enough to buy these $900 chairs or something around the board table. Well, the Star, the Gold, everybody, it was a huge story about really, compared with other money that we were spending. But it's the kind of story that makes it people.
probably would have thrown in jail for others.
Yeah. Yeah, then it was a Christmas party.
We don't talk about that.
No, we don't talk about that. You see, cold for legal, but no, they did a good, it was serious, and they were looking for it. It must have been frustrating for some of them. Rosemary was ill. She got struck throat with bronchitis. She wasn't there. But Lynn was there off and on, I think. Margaret was there quite a bit of the time. I don't know whether they were roads.
But when I was there last time, Sharon.
Oh yeah, Sharon is always there.
Betty.
Oh, Betty was there last night. Oh.
The new guy, Mark.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Did you go to the thing about the project? It's,
No, it's Monday.
yeah, Monday morning at Lynn's place. Well, I kind of spoke against it, and then I thought, well, I better not go too far. Damn things down. To me, it's just a waste of effort.
This is the funding.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, they're talking $20,000 to $50,000. I mean, who the hell are you? We have responsibility. And I worried about this Mark. He said he popped up with that. And I don't know if you Google his name. Oh yeah, quite a nuisance. And here, there, and everywhere. China, so he's still, kind of wondering nervous thing. But I didn't want to be negative about it because, they could dream up programs and they could actually get money. The other thing is, we gave them about a week to get these projects. And I said, that money is already assigned. I know this. They've already talked for 3 months from these people. They know who's going to get the money. They gave their maybe goods and grass left for somebody. Basically, that money is gone. And I didn't like to see them putting a lot of effort into it. I figured, money we have, but and I haven't heard anything back from them, so I don't know whether they're actually going to prepare something. That's being, late. Oh no, the 8th people, June the 5th. Yeah.
This is happening next week.
No, it's frustrating. We know now after 2 years it's not going to change. It isn't an organization, it's one person.
looking forward to the cottage in July. Our plan for July is kind of it's always after the cottage day, so. When we leave, did we clean up everything right?
So a month ago, when your profile said you had
Yeah, that's right, they are on the walls.
sap everywhere. So that'll be a good thing, because it's not gonna be fixed for a long time, so it has to happen, you have to clean up with that. I got rid of the past.
We interacted.
Our past crafts and I can, 2013, profile with systems work. For the Mercedes, they didn't
My research assistant.
and so, I mean, myself, this won't solve those problems, but they can change. First of all, you're gonna find people who have basically much more than paid first, and then they got training. So even some of the
I'm
people
on
who
that.
don't have same. You're still still have to be going into, I don't know what, depending on how good they are, from 6 to 12 weeks of training. So you train them to do systems.
He said it was taking a red eye, so I'm not sure.
So it's, I mean, it's gonna go on for years. It's, well, half of the transactions will have. Depends. Some of the bills, some are 100% automatic, and so the average.
By the way, I need to call you.
So I don't know if that's.
Well, they're all fine. Some of them might be awesome, but I just keep thinking I have to go by the bed or something. I was gonna do this last time, but then I did it abstract.
I was actually, I mentioned software.
Planners in my engineers
In around 3 quarters of an hour.
East Vancouver.
Every time they do a patch, they have to do a patch, the shows HR system, and all different patches.
Because I'll take them.
Ideally, change all these services.
Oh, sorry, just dropped the cord.
Because every time unless I change.
But she's,
Okay, well,
I'll send her a note.
yeah, then I'll get, I should somehow get that message.
So that just makes the problem worse.
Has track.
Next year,
Until
Yeah, it's been a rough week for us.
But I mean, you know, you have to change the numbers of trees. You still working with some trees? That's nice.
everybody, or probably I should say good late afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the ACW International Panel on Darker Politics, Democracies, Labor Rights, and Climate Change. A big thank you to the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources, because they've invited us to use Innis, and a particular thank you to Rafael Gomez, the director of that center. I'm Carla Lipsig-Mummé, the lead researcher of ACW. ACW actually is a welcome shortage for a very long name for a research project. It is called Adapting Canadian Work and Workplaces to Respond to Climate Change, therefore ACW. This is the 6th of ACW's international panels, and up to today, our goal has simply been to bring to the interested public, free, speakers whose new, challenging, creative, and effective action about climate change, particularly in the struggle to slow global warming, has made a difference internationally. So in 2015, we had Roger Cox, who was the Dutch lawyer who took his government with an NGO to court for failure of duty of care of the population for not slowing the reduction of GHGs fast enough, and won. Over the time, we have had a number of speakers who have been able to bring forward new ideas, effective ideas, things that can be used internationally, that can be shared across countries. The things we've focused on, and always our goals have been to bring the world of work and the union movement into these struggles that we're having by bringing speakers who will excite and interest you. Always as well, we work to encourage an international pollination of these interesting new things that people are doing so that they can be carried, for example, from the Netherlands to Canada. Could we do this here, what Roger Cox did? And questions like this. We've focused on climate and work, but today is different. I'm not suggesting we're not focusing on climate and work, but over the last 18 months, the politics of the world has turned dark and darker. Impossible now in North America to analyze or act on labor rights or the struggle to slow global warming without squarely facing the threat to the democracies of the world and the effect of that threat on climate action and rights and powers, the powers of worker organizations. In other words, democracy, politics, the darker politics, have to now be factored actively rather than implicitly into the struggles to slow global warming and to make sure that unions play the creative role that they can in scripting how greenhouse gases will be reduced. So in the dark and darker politics, and I'm hoping we don't get to darkest politics next year, but in this orientation, in this focus, we're saying then we need to bring the politics in and need to do it implicitly, explicitly, not implicitly. Our moderator today is Larry Brown. Larry Brown is president of NUPCHI, the National Union of Provincial and General Employees. He's also president of CCPA, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. But Larry is also one of Canada's most influential labor environmentalists. Put these things all together, and let's turn it over to Larry Brown to moderate.
That's so nice, Carla. Thank you for saying that. Good afternoon. We have a panel called Darker Politics, Democracies, Labor Rights, and Climate Change. Three entirely different subjects, no relation between them at all, maybe. Talking about politics these days, I was actually, on my way over, I had lunch with somebody who was telling me some of the latest misadventures of do we have to say President Trump? Can we find a different term? Some of you will know about a building trades worker who came up with a very important theory about how we perceive politics. His name was Overton, and he was a window framer. And he said there's a window of acceptable thought. one of the reasons that the right was so successful that they moved that window of acceptable thought. I moved it the wrong way. They brought it this way to the right. And I'm thinking that if Overton was writing today, he wouldn't be talking about where the window is. He'd be talking about Alice's looking glass and how you get through it to the strange world on the other side. But as bizarre as that political environment is next door to us, Carla is dead right that there is a very dark shade of politics that's coming to the forefront in too many places. And the connection between that darker politics and labor rights and climate change is actually very straightforward. It is no coincidence that over the past 25 years or so, we've seen the ascendancy of neoliberalism, called classic conservatism, neoliberalism, basically right-wing philosophy. At the same time as that has been in the ascendancy, the attacks on the labor movement have been in the ascendancy, because the labor movement is one of the organizations that is capable of keeping democracy strong. Not just representing workers in the workplace, but actually responsible for keeping democracy strong, which is quite a challenge. But if you look at the studies of the OECD and the International Labor Organization, they have come to the conclusion that without strong unions, you cannot have strong democracies. And the labor movement in the United States is now down at close to losing critical mass altogether. And the weaker they have become as a union movement, the worse the democratic system in the US has become. And the labor movement plays an important role in the civic democracy of a country as well. Without a strong labor movement, there's going to be much weaker NGO populations. The whole NGO sector is going to be weaker, and their ability to enter into debates, including the crucial one of climate change, is going to be that much weaker. So the nexus is very clear. It's very, very much there. And one of the things that we should all think about as we're listening to our panel is that darker politics requires the absence of lighter politics. Let me see if I can make that make a little bit more sense. Darker politics arises where there is some kind of a vacuum. And I don't want to be sort of unnecessarily pessimistic on a Friday afternoon, but do any of you think right now that the situation that we're living in is somehow acceptable when we've got the 1% have taken all of the economic gains for the last 25 years, where our society, our living conditions as a community have declined? I've asked this before in other audiences. How many of you are old enough to remember when you could walk down the street in Toronto, and if you were panhandled, you were surprised? And now, think about it, if you walk down the street in Toronto, anywhere downtown, and you're not panhandled, you wonder what the heck's going on. That's a microcosm, that's not the entire description, but our society has become a less generous, less caring, less sharing society because people who had money and power have figured out to take most of it for themselves. And working people in Canada have barely held their own for the last 2 decades. And basically, in any way that you look at it, you can conclude that it's not just our climate that is deteriorating. It's our ability to function as a society. And one of the problems that we've had is that the people who've talked the loudest about that recently in the last decade have been those on the far right. And the people in the sort of the center have come up with wimpy non-responses to the crisis. And wimpy non-responses to the crisis just don't cut it anymore. I have a poem that most of you would be familiar with that I like to think about when the forces of darkness are strong. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. And in it says, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Just think back to the last federal election in the US and think about whether that might apply. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Gramsci calls it an interregnum. He says that we're in a situation where the old elites have lost their luster. People don't trust them anymore. People understand that the old elites are not delivering the quality of life that we expect. And it's uncertain when that happens what the next step will be. Trump is a very logical reaction to that set of events. And I use that word logical very carefully. I mean, it's politically logical that somebody would be able to take advantage of that situation and get to be president, even though he's a nutcase. It is perfectly understandable how that took place, because the Democrats in the United States, and it's safer to talk about the United States than to talk about Canadian politics, but you can all apply your own sort of Canadian examples to this. The Democrats in the States were scared to talk about the issues. They made little adjustments and little tweaks in their programs, and Trump said, this is not satisfactory, we're going to change it. One of the last lines of that poem I quoted is, and what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. There's a connection between darker politics and labor rights and climate change. And we're going to have a very distinguished and articulate panel to help us work our way through that. I think what I'll do, with their permission, they can't actually refuse. Pretty hard for them to. What I'm going to do is introduce them all right now, and then they will come and speak to you in this order. We have with us Tony Burman, who is right now a world affairs columnist for the Toronto Star, has had an incredible journey through really a prominent name in the news business in Canada, was head of CBC News, I didn't know this until I got your bio, head of Al Jazeera in Qatar, a very distinguished career in news and documentaries, got awards in several different places and for several different reasons. He's been editor-in-chief of CBC and has been a distinguished professor of journalism at Ryerson. What a wonderful list of attributes. So Tony Burman is going to talk to us first about darker politics, about democracies and what's happened. And then Dr. Elaine Bernard. I don't very often call you Dr. Bernard, but it says it right here. Yeah. And Elaine right now is the Senior Research Associate at the Labor and Work-Life Program at Harvard University in the law school. And I have to remind myself of that because I've known Elaine for quite a long time as the executive director there. And she built that program into a major international school for new leaders coming along. She's a brilliant describer of tactical, how do you actually fit your tactics into a broader strategy? How do you create a strategy? What should the union movement be thinking about? She is quite literally world-renowned. I know that as a fact because she's busy. When I try and find Elaine, she's usually, if she's not at Harvard, she's in some other country leading trade unionists there. Right now, she's focused on promoting the role of unions in promoting civil society, democracy, and sustainable development. And we're not above nepotism. She's also on the steering committee of the ACW, so we're putting our own forward. And also from the steering committee, the executive director of the BC Federation of Labor, Jim Chorostecki. I got that exactly right, yes. Because I know you use Jim more than, we don't use last names that much. Jim has actually specialized in bringing disparate groups together in BC to work on solving the problems of climate change. And if you think about BC with the environmental challenges versus the people who work in the resource industries, that Jim is still standing is a tribute to his success in doing that. Before that, he was with the Public Service Alliance of Canada, with the Union of Postal Communication Employees, and with the federal government. And, you know, those things are interesting, but his real claim to fame is that he was a former board member of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in BC, and is on the advisory committee for a good economy project with the CCPA BC. Some wonderful people to speak to you about a very challenging set of issues, and first I'll turn it please to Tony.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here, to be in front of such an impressive audience, and to be speaking about such an important topic. The theme is darker politics, a world turning darker as racist nationalism spreads. How's that for an upbeat, amusing setup to what I think will be a wonderful weekend for you all? The suicide room, by the way, is just over there. Turn to your left, and we can accommodate you. Before I get to the serious stuff, I do have some good news for you. As you know, the G7 leaders, including Donald Trump, met today in Sicily. The meeting ends tomorrow, Trump's last day on his foreign trip before returning to Washington. In a meeting with the Prime Minister of Belgium, Trump spent most of it complaining about the European Union. He said that having so much difficulty getting approval for his golf courses was evidence enough for him that the EU was inefficient. But the good news, there is good news, was that he apparently spent the entire meeting munching on Belgian chocolates, which the Prime Minister brought with him. He declared them the absolute best. Now, this is a good thing, particularly to those of us who look at this pudgy, out-of-shape 70-year-old and wonder whether issues of health will be a more likely way to end his presidency than impeachment. So keep those Belgian chocolates coming. But seriously, this G7 meeting gives every sign that it will turn into a train wreck. No surprise. Trump shocked NATO leaders yesterday by refusing to endorse the alliance's mutual defense pledge. Today at the G7 in Sicily, there were signs that the US will veto conciliatory language about refugees and climate change in tomorrow's final communique. Apparently, this is the new normal. The premise of this panel, which I share, is that the world is turning darker. Our democracies, I would argue, are under threat. From Brexit in the UK last June, to the improbable election of Trump in November and his dangerous, chaotic presidency, to the unbridled nationalism building now in countries like Turkey, Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere in Europe, to the threat of the emboldened far right in elections this year in Austria, the Netherlands, and France, and soon in the UK and Germany. And of course, never to be forgotten, the often hidden, always threatening role of Russia and Vladimir Putin to do what they can do to bring Western democracy down. This creates special challenges for those of us here in Canada. How do we protect our democracy? How do we learn from other countries and from history? And how do we shape our own approach to crucial issues such as refugees and immigration? For what it is worth, I will give you some of my own thoughts about these Canadian challenges. But before that, I'd like to focus on some of the global actors in this surreal drama in which we find ourselves. Actors like Putin of Russia, Angela Merkel of Germany, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen of France. Obviously prompted by our main actor, Donald Trump, I sense that we are all trapped inside his own reality show. So let's go with that for a few minutes. After all, we have endured hours of gripping television to get to this point, even if recent episodes of Trump World have hinted where this is going. Spoiler alert, if you don't want to know. But I think it is now clear how this drama will end. The show's main character, played by Trump, will be unmasked as a bumbling Russian stooge and kleptomaniac hiding in the Oval Office. And he will soon get bumped off, probably sometime next season. The hints suggest he will either be impeached or forced to resign for health reasons, hence our enthusiasm for Belgian chocolates. The only thing we don't exactly know yet is whether this reality show will end in laughter or in tears. In episodes to come, will the show become a replay of All the President's Men? As you all recall, that riveting 1974 political thriller by Woodward and Bernstein was about corruption in high places that chronicled the Watergate scandal and the downfall of President Richard Nixon. Or will the story go in the direction of political satire, as it did in Stanley Kubrick's 1964 black comedy starring Peter Sellers, when an unhinged US Air Force general orders a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union? Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. We shall have to stand by our televisions and wait and see, but the options are still very wide open. Every week, events give the show's genius scriptwriters lots to work with. Let's look at the key actors, starting, of course, with Trump. After about 125 days of President Trump, we should be thankful. Planet Earth still revolves around the sun, little birds twitter throughout the night, and enormous stars still twinkle in the polluted skies above. But beyond that, all bets are off. The world has every reason to be utterly baffled about the Trump doctrine on America's role in the world. If it had hoped to discern one after 3 months of Donald Trump's presidency, his performance so far has been chaotic and incoherent. But if we can extract any pattern from his early days in the job, it is enough to give the world heartburn. Trump seems obsessed with appearing tough and using military force as a way of imposing his will, rather than being driven by consistency or ideology. It is still early days, but it is a dangerous addiction for any US president to exhibit. By any measure, Trump has experienced a dismal first 100 days in both domestic and foreign policy terms. His actual accomplishments in terms of legislation have been virtually non-existent, and Trump's approval ratings at this stage of his presidency are the lowest in modern American political history. But it is perhaps his behavior on the global stage that has been most baffling and most worrisome. Trump promoted an aggressive America First agenda during his campaign and roared into office last January, promising to reshape what he called the weak and stupid foreign policy of his predecessor, Barack Obama. But then apparently he ran into reality and flip-flops began. No, China will not be declared a currency manipulator on day one in office, as he had promised. No, he doesn't still believe that Japan and South Korea should have their own nuclear weapons. No, he doesn't oppose the global Export-Import Bank anymore. No, NATO is not obsolete, as he described it during the campaign. And no, the US will not move its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And no, he will not tear up NAFTA, as he had vowed. Trump seemed to explain away all of this in an interview when he said of the US government overall, quote, "I never realized how big it was." Coming from a White House that appears divided about the road ahead, these reversals have been occurring at a breathtaking pace. Not surprisingly, they have largely been welcomed by America's foreign policy establishment, particularly the military hawks in the Republican Party. But to America's allies abroad, the Trump track record so far has been contradictory and alarming, raising the obvious concern: if Trump can suddenly ditch what were once described as his core principles, what does that say about the rest of his presidency? Or about how truly steadfast America's resolve will be on their behalf? The never-ending political and personal drama inherent in Trump's presidency is not only exhausting, it distracts us from what really matters and what really is happening. Many of Trump's international initiatives in the past 100 days have been appalling. He has embraced the authoritarian regimes of Turkey and Egypt. In the days before France's presidential vote, he expressed support for National Front leader Marine Le Pen, who is both racist and anti-Semitic. His actions regarding North Korea have been recklessly provocative, and his treatment of China, by far the most important relationship for the US, has been inconsistent. In addition, Trump has yet to deal publicly with the implications of Russia's hacking of the American electoral process last year. Instead, he has done everything to switch the topic. In spite of these attempts, what is being investigated by the FBI is the suggestion that Trump campaign officials, perhaps with his knowledge, colluded with Russia to disrupt the presidential election campaign. If proven, that would constitute treason, which is a mind-boggling scenario confronting the US presidency. The other major international issue still in play is America's response to climate change. Trump has already signed executive orders that serve to undo many of the climate change initiatives of the Obama presidency, and this is just one example, but perhaps one of the most important examples of the gradual abdication of American leadership globally under President Trump. So that's our main character. How about his supporting cast? Vladimir Putin, for example. Can anyone figure out what's going on between Putin and his comrade in arms in Washington, Donald Trump? So much effort to stop that investigation, something must be going on. And now we hear that Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is a target of the FBI investigation. However, as for Putin, his fingerprints seem to be everywhere. But there are a few dimensions to a story that we shouldn't lose sight of. Russia is not the Soviet Union, and never will be. Putin may strut, may preen, and may bluster, and like the KGB operative he once was, he is skilled at manipulating the optics of a situation. But like Trump, Putin is a phony. When all is said and done, he doesn't have the economic or military firepower to deliver on his threats. Compared with the Soviet Union, Russia's economy is strikingly weak and fully integrated with the West. If tensions ever escalated to the point of actual war, Russia would be annihilated, and Putin, above all, knows that. Russia's saber-rattling is still unnerving the West. It is messing with the heads of American and European politicians, military leaders, and opinion makers. And in response, NATO and its member states, including the US, are embarking on their own military buildup, particularly in countries neighboring Russia. They are using the Russian threat, exaggerated as it is, as a pretext for challenging Russia in its own backyard. That's a recipe for disaster. Putin isn't the only threat here. Our leaders also need to be watched as closely as we watch Putin. Now, let's look at the next supporting character in this reality show, Angela Merkel of Germany. Once Barack Obama left office, we learned what the next leader of the free world looked like. No, not that American guy with his orange hair who seemingly sleeps in his navy blue business suit. I mean somebody completely different. Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, a scientist by training, fluent in Russia, and brought up in communist East Germany, is increasingly being seen as the last leader left in defense of the post-Second World War international order. Merkel's close relationship with Obama was evident yesterday in Berlin when they both were together. Obama was in Berlin to help celebrate 500 years since Martin Luther's Reformation. He received a rock star's welcome from crowds at the Brandenburg gates. When they first started working together in 2009 after Obama was elected, there were personal and political frictions, but that gradually transformed into a smooth partnership between the two leaders and between the United States and Germany. In their final news conference, it was as if Obama was handling the mantle of Western leadership to the German chancellor. They both talked about their history of shared values, the importance of close cooperation between the United States and Europe, and the need to stand up to Russia when international security is at stake. But they were not only talking to their respective national audiences, in essence, they were aiming their sharp remarks at Trump himself. Trump's election, declared in the early morning hours of November 9th, is seen in much of Europe as a watershed, and nowhere is this more deeply felt than in Germany's capital, Berlin. It was on November 9th, 1989, when, not far from where Obama and Merkel were speaking yesterday, the Berlin Wall separating East and West Germany came down. And it was on November 9th, 1938, when on Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Nazis accelerated their rise in Germany by attacking Jewish synagogues, homes, and shops. In Germany, the ghosts of the past are never forgotten. The anti-establishment right-wing populism that fueled Trump's victory is also rampant in Europe. It was at the core of Britain's surprising Brexit vote in June and has increased votes in every election so far this year in Europe. As for Merkel, she is standing for election again this September. Although she earned considerable international respect for her handling of the refugee crisis, she has suffered a political backlash within Germany, and there was some speculation she would step down. But the challenge of Trump, ironically, has strengthened her position, and she is well ahead in current polls. Finally, let's go to France for our final set of actors, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen. It was described as perhaps the most important European election in a generation, and it didn't disappoint. France dodged a bullet, at least for the time being, by rejecting the angry voices of the far right and overwhelmingly electing a political novice as its president. But the clock is still ticking for France and for the rest of Europe. The threat of the nationalist far right in Europe remains powerful, and general economic stagnation is still widely felt. Unless Macron turns out to be a miracle man, most realists see his victory as, at best, a temporary reprieve. In addition, and never to be forgotten, is the fact that the results still place Marine Le Pen, the far-right National Front leader, in a strong position to compete for power in the next presidential election. However, it was a stunning personal victory for Macron. At 39 years of age, exuding all charm and sunny ways as a campaigner, he is the youngest head of state in France since Napoleon in 1848. The former investment banker had formed his own political movement a year ago, knowing that France had never elected a president from outside the traditional parties. Macron ran as an independent centrist. The battle for France had assumed enormous importance, even though voters in Austria and the Netherlands had turned against extremist parties in earlier elections. But the glow of Macron's victory may well extend to Germany in September, when Chancellor Merkel goes up for re-election. At issue there, as well as in France and elsewhere in Europe, is the overriding choice in front of voters. Can Europe's current leaders solve the serious economic and social problems confronting the continent? Or is it time to try out the more extremist nationalist political options? Europe's leaders particularly welcome the presence in France of a passionate pro-European leader such as Macron, but their enthusiasm will extend only as long as Macron's popularity does, and that may be short-lived. There's a dismal track record in France of presidents starting off with wonderfully high approval ratings. Mitterrand, Chirac, Sarkozy, Hollande, and then following dramatically out of favor. Macron will face his first obstacle in a month when France again goes to the polls for its parliamentary elections. It is a long shot to expect that Macron's new party can win enough seats for a majority. But without a majority, his effectiveness as president will be compromised. The other challenge for Macron is the extent of France's economic problems. They have stymied many a French politician. Macron has promised to make France more competitive worldwide and to strengthen its ties with the European Union in an effort to assure establishment voices anxious about the prospect of a National Front victory. But in spite of his supporters' euphoria after the victory, the road ahead for Macron will not be smooth. As a former banker and briefly a minister in the government, his policies are in line with the current government. But these past policies have not worked, and that government is now deeply unpopular. Why should Macron, his charm aside, not eventually meet the same fate? If that happens, and many are predicting that it will happen, Le Pen, who is only 48 years of age, will still be a formidable presence in French politics. She received about 34% of the vote, more than double her party's previous best. Even more significant and incredible as this may sound from outside France, the party also seemed to further distance itself among many young French voters from the racist, anti-Semitic past of the National Front under its founder, Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine's father. The party will inevitably benefit from this amnesia in the years ahead. For those who believe in a united, progressive, and tolerant Europe, that alarming prospect should focus the mind. So, Canada. How should we here in Canada respond to these challenges? I mean, certainly with humility, but also with realism and with political courage. I mean, this creates, I think, as we all know, special challenges for our politics. How do we protect our democracy? I think we do it by being vigilant about the kind of cyber attacks on our processes that not only did we see in the United States, but has been evident throughout Europe. And certainly by not allowing big money into politics, which I think is one of the factors that has so poisoned the American political process. And also by distinguishing or making distinct the unhappiness that many people have with the unfairness of our economic system as compared with a kind of a visceral racist response to newcomers. I mean, that can get blurred and has been blurred, not only in parts of the US, but certainly in parts of Europe. And that distinction, above all here in Canada, must never be forgotten. How do we learn from other countries and from history? Well, I think the aspect that, I think in some ways, in terms of our theme, darker politics, I think there is a lot to feel optimistic about if we somehow, for the sake of discussion, can kind of park the Trump issue aside. I mean, I think Europeans did respond to the threat that faced them up to this point in their elections by turning away, in many cases, from the far right, even though many of these far right parties gained votes, they didn't come close to gaining power. I think you have, and that's something that I think those of us in Canada who can, I think we can be somewhat smug about the threat that these kinds of forces have in our own kind of societies. I think that kind of fight back on the part of Europeans should not only be identified, but should be emulated. I think in terms of the American situation, and I defer to Elaine and others here who have come from the battlefield, so to speak, I think it has to be noted and celebrated, the incredible resistance that has developed in so many levels, in so many places, in so many corners of America against the whole kind of Trump reality. I think not only does one see it in a formal sense in terms of the institutions that one would expect would respond to this kind of thing, whether it's the American judicial system or the American media, the American news media, certainly, and I marvel at their output every day, the New York Times and the Washington Post. But I think equally powerful, I think, has been in small towns, small villages, big cities, has been the kind of the popular resistance to many of the Trump policies, beginning obviously at the beginning of his presidency with the anti-Muslim ban, but also since then. So I really do think that if that society, and dare I say, affects us all, can kind of hang in until the next opportunity for elections, which would be the midterms next year, then I think that there can be a kind of a turnaround. But I think in terms of getting back to Canada, I think that one has to, as outsiders to this incredibly dramatic story that's unfolding south of our borders, have to be impressed at the spirit and the courage that so many people at so many levels of American society are exhibiting. Finally, how do we shape our own approach to crucial issues such as refugees and immigration? I think by recognizing and cherishing and never forgetting the distinctive history of this country for all of our flaws in welcoming newcomers. And that's not only embodied, I think, for a lot of people outside of Canada in the decision a few years ago of allowing so many Syrian refugees in, but I think the whole pattern, I think one of the realities of that story when it kind of broke 2 or 3 years ago was that we were reminded that if we go back decades, that the borders of this country have been open to all sorts of people in a way that's been genuine, in a way that's been quite selfless. And I think that it's easy for us to forget that if one looks at some of the darker aspects of the European reality and some of the, although I'm always struck by the generosity of Americans, clearly its leadership now almost encourages us to forget that part of the American kind of experience. I want to wrap my remarks up just with a final reference to Donald Trump's reality show. After all, we are part of it, kind of big time. Yes, it may go the way of All the President's Men, and Richard Nixon fans should get ready, but there's a lot of black comedy to the story, so it may go the direction of Dr. Strangelove. The scriptwriters may have fun with the story in the months ahead. Remember that the suspicion about Trump is that Russia has something on him, either of a personal nature or due to Russian financing of his empire or something like that. In other words, that he is effectively a stooge of Putin. Given that, it was incredible that Trump's first major meeting in the Oval Office the day after he had fired FBI Chief James Comey was with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and it was a meeting where only TASS, the Russian news agency, was allowed in. No American media was allowed into the Oval Office. TASS distributed pictures of a smiling Trump with the Russian delegation to the world, and there was no indication that the US president even raised the issue of Russia's hacking of the US election with Lavrov. And there's more. In whatever direction this story goes in future episodes, drama or satire, the reality show scriptwriters will need to get it out of Washington occasionally to make it a smash hit in global terms. In that regard, Canada's hockey interests were certainly well served recently. After the US president fired the FBI chief, journalists wanted reaction from Trump's comrade in arms, Putin, but Putin was nowhere to be found in Moscow. It took a Canadian journalist, Elizabeth Palmer, of CBS News to track him down playing hockey in Sochi, site of the 2014 Olympic Winter Games. Fully dressed in hockey gear, Putin came off the ice for a moment and replied to Palmer's questions. "Your questions look funny to me," said Putin. "What do we have to do with this? I'm planning to play hockey with fans and you're invited." According to CBS, Putin then went on to score 7 goals in that hockey game. You simply cannot make this stuff up. Thank you for your attention.
I was very happy that Tony covered the rest of the world, so it allows me to go into the hole in the world that is now the new administration. It's been 6 months since the 2016 US election, and we've had the experience of the first 125 days of a new administration. I probably don't need to remind anybody that it was a remarkable election. I mean, the 2 least popular candidates in the history of the United States played off against each other, and we ended up electing a wealthy, we think, he says so, but we don't have any facts because again, remarkably, he doesn't seem willing to release his financial information. But a real estate mogul, we do know that, a self-promoting, egotistic entertainer, a racist, xenophobic, sexist, the Olympics of every imaginable despicable character, who lost the popular vote and still ended up being elected president because he won the Electoral College, an organization, an institution that's very old and goes back to some of the issues of slavery, so that, how do you, when you deny rights to certain people, how do you weight people who you don't consider people? Well, you create a thing called the Electoral College. So, what can I say? The residuals of slavery still continue right into today. And the slogan was, "Let's make America great again," which is sort of an interesting slogan because, it's a reference to, it's hard to be against being great, but what do we mean great? Does that mean other people are less great? And when was America great? When was it great? And who was it great for? It's a very unusual slogan. He did promise to make the American workers will finally have a president who will protect them and fight for them. So we should look at the record on this. Well, he started by appointing the wealthiest cabinet ever, with executives from Wall Street and Goldman Sachs. I think there's 5 leaders from Goldman Sachs on the current executive. He had a Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who's the former CEO of Exxon. For those of you who always thought oil money ran America, energy ran America, all our wars were about energy, well, now we've got the Secretary of State from Exxon. He appointed Betty DeVos as Secretary of Education, a promoter of privatization and charter schools, who doesn't believe in a public education system, as the head of the Secretary of Education. He promoted a racist Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General with responsibility for enforcing civil rights and the Equal Employment and Opportunity Commission. And he appointed as the administrator of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the former Attorney General of a state who built a career suing the EPA and seeking to limit its mandate. And of course, he did lose one of his appointments. He attempted to appoint Andrew Posner who was a fast food magnate, as the Secretary of Labor. Again, someone who's totally opposed to the mission of the Department of Labor. It's sort of, if you believe, the notion of you've got matter and antimatter, this is the first anti-cabinet cabinet, where everybody in the cabinet seems opposed to the mission of the cabinet. It's quite, well, if it was a comedy, I don't even think then would it be funny, much less this being the reality of what we're facing. So on the environment, of course, Trump is a denier on climate change. He's not just a denier. I mean, in characteristic bloated language that he loves to use, he in fact called climate change a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. He's included in his cabinet many deniers, and then we have a new category called quibblers. They say, yes, there's a thing called climate change, but we're not sure how much of it is caused by humans. I dare not ask what they think it's caused by. So, and he's also introduced one of the things that I think is very, very dangerous, which is this notion of, we're now talking about alt facts. I'm old enough to remember that we had a term for what we now call alt facts. It was lies, untruths. There's not a matter of you've got facts and alt facts. You have facts. And then you could have interpretation of facts. You have interpretations. And your interpretations might differ a great deal in the extreme. But the notion of a world where there are no facts is a very frightening world. You can never resolve anything. And what we've seen is now political debates where we disregard the notion of facts or evidence. I mean, that's sort of elitist, don't you think? Maybe just everybody should just say whatever they think. And when they say whatever they think, if you disagree with them, then it becomes like, well, you have your facts, I have mine. And I'm sort of, this sort of shakes me. And I've seen it actually come into Canada. The other day I was having, you've all gone through this experience, dinner with family. And a certain member of my family said, immigration's gone too far in Canada. We're letting in too many immigrants from Africa. I said, Africa? I said, yeah, a majority of the immigrants in Canada today are from Africa. I said, well, that's sort of incredible. Where did you hear that? Where did you find that? He says, I don't want to argue. I said, well, I don't want to argue. I'm prepared to accept the notion that a majority of immigrants in Canada are from Africa, if you can, and then we can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So let's start by establishing the factual basis. Because, we have things like Stats Canada as the government. Okay, but immigration's pretty straightforward. Like, people can be counted. There's one person and another person, and when they come in, we note their presence. So there are things called facts. And no, you just want to argue, I don't want to argue. Well, you can see it becomes impossible to have a reasoned discussion. And you know what? It becomes impossible to have a democratic society where you have yours, I have mine, let's not argue, my facts, your facts. How can you live in a world where there are no facts? So I'm sufficiently, and of course, why I lay this at Trump, he's not the only person who does this. Hell, happens in my own family. But he's the one who opened this very notion to the highest level in politics. Remember, Trump was a birther. He denied, he paid for and publicized the crazy notion that President Obama was not actually a US citizen, was not born in the United States. And as if that wasn't far enough, he also proposed the notion that he actually didn't graduate from Harvard. Now, I'm not keen, I don't give a shit whether you graduated from Harvard or from James Brown, or if you never graduated. But one of the things is, when you graduate from a university, in law school, you spend 3 years going to school with other people who do see you there. Also, Harvard is the wealthiest university in the world. You know why? Because they keep track of their alumni. And they're hitting them up for money all the time. So you don't graduate from Harvard Law School and get lost. It's not something you can fake. So anyway, so this notion of, you know, how do you trace down someone who says there are no facts? And so when we look at the administration, we need to judge it. And I am totally irrational. So I am a rational person. I am quite willing to accept that we elected a president who said the American worker will finally have a president who will protect them and fight for them. So I want to judge him, not by his crazy words, but by his actions. Because that's where facts are. Facts aren't just words, they're actions, they're reality. So let's judge him, not by alt facts, whatever craziness he says when he gets out of bed, goes into the bathroom, sits there with his iPhone and tweets the latest silliness, but let's judge him by his actions. So, well, first there's the anti-cabinet. That looks a little problematic. On the environment, of course, let's look at his budget. Follow the money. That's one of the things you do when you look for facts. So, in the United States, the budget consists of 2 parts. 3/4 of the budget is already set. It's non-discretionary. It's Medicare, Medicaid, etc. 1/4 of the budget is what's called discretionary. 1/4 of all federal government funding is discretionary. And what happened to the budget with respect to protecting workers? Well, the largest single cut in the budget went to the Environmental Protection Agency. It's 31% cut of the EPA. Labor Department had a 21% cut of their budgets. Health and Human Services, workers are humans, we have health issues, 18% cut. For those who are worried about the infrastructure, not a problem. Transportation had a 17% cut. Cut, points after point. On the Environment Agency, the EPA, he appointed Scott Pruitt, who is, of course, like the rest of the anti-cabinet, opposed to the mission of the Environmental Protection Agency. So what did he do? One of his first actions was to purge the website of information about the environment. You know, you come in, normally there's a bit of purging that goes on when there's a change in government, but not usually of documents, reports, science study. It's not like, you know, our scientists now deny everything your scientists. Again, it's that alt facts notion. They banned the use of the term climate change. Can you imagine, you're in an agency, an environmental protection agency, and you notice things are happening to the environment, and you're not allowed to talk about climate change because you've been banned from using the term. They reduced, of course, the size and the scope of the agency, but they have done some new hires. They've appointed basically skeptics and climate deniers as key people in this agency. Folks who oppose the mission are now in the driver's seat. They've sought to dismantle Obama-era regulations aimed at increasing the federal government's authority over rivers, streams, wetlands, in order to prevent water pollution. They've promulgated federal or executive orders to unwind regulations aimed at curbing, planet warming pollution from coal-fired power plants. They've weakened rules mandating higher fuel standards. Pruitt sees the environmental regs as, and he's been quoted on this, intrusive and harmful to business. Well, he should have been in Commerce, not in the Environmental Protection Agency. Interestingly, he's actually coming under some fire because he's not yet figured out a way to deal with what's called the endangerment finding. And the endangerment finding is a legal finding where the Environmental Protection Agency went to court and had made a case that CO2 emissions endangered public health, part of what's happening with climate change. They were challenged, it went to the courts, and the courts basically said, no, this is a correct part of the mission of the Environmental Protection Agency, and in fact, they said the agency has a legal requirement to regulate smokestacks, tailpipes, spewing, planted warming pollution, that the court said this is part of your agency mission. Well, now that's tricky because that's a court decision and it's not something Congress can easily turn around. But they're currently under research. So instead of researching, environmental harm, global warming, all that, instead they're researching how to deny this stuff and how to get out of regulations. And of course, they reversed the Keystone XL moratorium and even did some PR around coal is back. You gotta be kidding. Nobody believes that. They have made some comments about Paris 2015, the climate pledge to reduce greenhouse gases 25 to 28% by 2025, but again have not yet come out with a specific. And they've been researching how to stop what they've said they're interested in the EPA is that they'd rather regulation happen at a state level. And yet they're researching how to prevent states like California with superior regulation to federal regulation and to be able to block them. Because of course there's a thing called the federal preemption, which in the United States, a federal system, not unsimilar to Canada, where when the federal government has spoken and has regulated in an area, it prevents states without special permission from improving standards. Now, California has had an exemption to the federal preemption. But if you look at labor law in the United States, it gets worse and worse. And there's many states that would love to improve the labor law for private sector employees. They can't because of the federal preemption. And one might point out that a lot of these attacks on the EPA, et cetera, kill workers. Some of what we're talking about is going to have a detrimental effect on the lives of working people, their families, et cetera. And so, what about labor? I mean, surely a man who speaks about wanting to be the president to represent and fight for workers, I mean, we would have to look at labor regulation and the Department of Labor. Well, one of the first actions they did was to protect Wall Street against the interest of workers. And by that I mean, great term, the fiduciary rule. It seems that the Obama administration put forward a rule, a regulation that said financial professionals must recommend retirement investment products that serve the best interests of their clients. What a novel notion that the financial person who you go to for advice, we have to pass a regulation to say that they have a fiduciary responsibility to represent the interest of the client? Well, the new administration said, well, let's wipe that one out. Don't need that one. Wall Street doesn't like that. Second one was they blocked the ruling that employers keep accurate logs on workplace injuries and illness. Remember, they like alt facts. So if there are no records about workplace injuries, things start to look better in the records that aren't kept. So they again delayed the fair pay, safe workplace rules, which is that the federal government, like most large governments, is an employer of many contractors. And again, an Obama-era regulation that was being promulgated was that major federal contractors had to disclose previous workplace violations so that, you know, we would know who we're dealing with. Stop that one too. Healthcare. Well, the president discovered that it was complicated. And who knew? Well, everybody in America knew, but it seemed news to him. And so we now have a system that they are attempting to introduce that will probably be stopped at the Senate called, we're calling it Trump Care. But it's basically taking a questionable, difficult health care insurance system introduced by the Obama administration that, by the way, found health care for over 20 million Americans previously not covered, and are again trying to unravel it and change it to a much different system that will, according to the General Accounting Office, will result in close to 50 million Americans losing health care or finding it unaffordable over the next 10 years. Just incredible. Finally, they repealed the Department of Labor rule that would extend, would make it possible for, remember, this is the government that said, state and local governments, you should pass regulations. We want the freedom of the states. So the federal government under Obama was about to pass, or did pass, a regulation that would allow states to pass legislation so that employers would be able to put in a system, and maybe even required to put in a system, of individual retirement accounts where you automatically were opted in. You could still get out of it, but you had to consciously opt out, so you were automatically in it. And that would affect over 55 million workers. As you may know, there's a massive retirement crisis in the US, and the average worker has less than $10,000 in a retirement account if they do not have a defined benefit or defined contribution pension plan. So, of course, the big promise, and place where we saw some leaders of building trades union, was infrastructure. Now, here's something that is meaningful not only to workers, but to the community. We have bridges collapsing. We have a tremendous problem. We have water that is undrinkable in places like Flint. So a lot of infrastructure that just hasn't been dealt with. Trump promised $1 billion going into the infrastructure. Well, then we discovered some phony math. First, it's only, 1 trillion. Let's make it T in trillion. Well, it turns out the feds were only going to put in 200 billion, 1/5 of it. And then it turns out the money actually would come through cuts in other areas that would normally be considered as infrastructure. Then we found out that mostly it was going to come from the private sector and state and local government, which are currently being totally cut back on, but the private sector. And how would it come through from the private sector? Well, the private sector needs to make a profit in this. So let's reduce regulation around restrictions on tolls in federal interstate. Let's make it more possible to do things. So what's next? I mean, that's so far what we've seen is horror tale after horror tale. Well, it's only 125 days. So what we now see, not just with the change in the Supreme Court, is some new things that I believe you'll be seeing shortly. One is there's a case coming up to the new Supreme Court where a majority of justices will probably vote in favor of this. A new case that could lead to, it's called Janus versus AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, the largest public sector union in the country. And this is a really interesting case that basically says, because workers, same as in Canada, once you're organized by a union, once you represent by a union, and a union has a duty to represent all of its members fairly, all of the people in a bargaining union fairly, because there is what's called agency fee. That constitutes, they have to pay a small amount for that representation. That constitutes compelled speech, compelled association. It's a violation of freedom of association, the First Amendment, and therefore it should be banned. Well, what would that do? That would turn every public sector jurisdiction, meaning all public employees in the United States, right to work. We've seen right to work happen in some states where state employees have lost the right to agency fee, lost the right to representing everyone and everybody paying a fee for that right, for that work that the union is doing. And where that has happened, in Wisconsin for instance, unions have lost about 70% of their membership. And perfectly understandable, they've lost every right to represent workers and to speak on their behalf, and demoralization sets in. It's also quite possible, this will affect the public sector, it's also quite possible that we've not yet seen legislation, but there is some talk about federal right to work in the private sector, which of course is something, because labor law in the United States is federal. So with the majority in Senate, a majority in Congress, and a president who's a keener on protecting worker rights by destroying unions, that is quite possible. Lots of other possible things that can happen. So tell me something good. Tell me something good. So far it looks not only darker, colder, and meaner. Yeah, that's true. There's a war on the environment. There's a war on workers. And there's a war on civility in the United States. But here's something good. First, again, anyone who knows science, there's a thing called inertia. And normally inertia is a bad thing. I'm a change agent. I hate inertia. It means when I'm trying to change something, it's hard to move it. Well, that sometimes works two ways. And one of the things the Trump administration is running into is a hell of a lot of inertia. Inertia not just because first, his inability to concentrate for more than 2 minutes on anything, but secondly, a lot of the hard-won regulations, hard-won rights, aren't just on paper. They're things that people believe is right and just, and they're not easily turned around. Secondly, inertia in the sense of, even though he's claimed, you know, I'm going to undo all these regulations, discovering that it's a lot harder than he thought. And that, you know, he doesn't run California. Well, that's point number 2. States matter. States matter. What we're now seeing is California is stepping up as a state with much better regulation, but it also is, you know, the 6th largest economy in the world. And even in the United States, corporations look and say, well, you know, even though the federal government says they're reducing their standard, we actually don't want to ignore California, and we're not going to build cars, one type of car for this part of the country and a different car for California. We're going to have to try and have. Thirdly, there's the role of education. And there, I would say, what we've seen is scientists stepping up. For the first time in my life, I saw demonstrations by scientists and an understanding that we need to talk about that there are things called facts, that there is evidence, that there is a rational way to have discussions and debates, that yes, we have a right to our opinions, but our opinions should be based on fact. And then finally, one would think with everything we saw, you would see a totally defeated, demoralized community. What we've seen is in fact the complete opposite. And Tony mentioned a little bit, resist. On election night, the very next morning, the first demonstration started. Whatever happened to the honeymoon period? There is no honeymoon period. We've seen cities declaring themselves as sanctuary cities. So what we've seen is organizing at a level that I've never before seen in the United States. And it's very exciting because it's gone back to the most important thing to a democracy, which is understanding that rights are not something you put in paper. Paper's important, but ultimately, rights are things you exercise. And if we're going to deal with this crisis, both the crisis in labor rights, the crisis in the environment, then it's not a matter of just putting things on paper. It's getting out and exercising rights and changing things. Thank you.
Thank you. With respect to both Tony and Elaine, I'd like to elevate the discussion by quoting from South Park. When in doubt, blame Canada. So I'm going to talk about the softwood lumber dispute. And I have a PowerPoint. Oh, we're up. Okay, good. I have my daughter here with me, and part of coming here, she said, am this just going to hear the things you say at the dinner table and when we're riding in the car and you're yelling at the radio? Is it all just going to be the same stuff? And I said, yeah, but this time I got pictures. So I'll try to make it somewhat interesting. The other thing is that I'm hoping in this short presentation that I have here today that more to Elaine's point about the dinner table is that I'm going to give you a good 15-20 minutes of material that you can use at the dinner table to sound so intelligent about softwood lumber and the whole dispute and the impact on Canada. So I hope I haven't set the bar too high there. So I've used as a title about the softwood lumber dispute is the Hatfield-McCoy feud without guns so far. The Hatfields and the McCoys were two rural families that lived along the Big Sandy River in the years from 1863 to 1891. The Hatfields lived on the West Virginia side while the McCoys lived on the Kentucky side. The McCoys were considered a lower middle class family while the Hatfields were more affluent and they were also well connected politically. The bulk of the Hatfields' wealth came from their timbering operation, although, in fairness, both families were involved in the manufacturing and selling of illegal moonshine. The Hatfield-McCoy feud, some called it a war, has become synonymous with bitterly feuding rival parties. In this talk, I am comparing the Canada-US dispute, some call it a feud, over softwood lumber, comparable to that dispute, but as I said, without the guns so far. What I'm hoping to do is three parts. One is I want to talk and tell you what softwood lumber is. I want to talk about why it's important, what its significance is, and then I want to explore some of the darker politics that are at play here. In particular, I'm going to use British Columbia as the example and the explanation of what those politics are. So let's start from the very basic and the simplest, and that is, what is softwood lumber? Softwood lumber, by the way, defining it as hard and soft is not actually a direct definition of the lumber itself. It, in fact, is the genus of the lumber. Balsa is actually considered a hardwood, whereas here are some examples of softwood. Cedar is a softwood. Douglas fir is a softwood. Pine is a softwood. Redwood is a softwood, and spruce is a softwood. So these are examples, very popular woods and probably terminology, and trees that you've probably heard about and heard reference to in the past. So why softwood lumber? Why do we use softwood lumber? First of all, softwood lumber has a faster rate of growth than hardwood. Most softwood lumbers will mature between 25 to 35 years. Softwood has a lower density than hardwood, and it does make it easier to work with. About 80% of forested timber is softwood, and softwood in general is cheaper to produce, and as I mentioned before, is easier to work with. So how is softwood used? Softwood has a wide range of applications, primarily in building components, building frames including windows and doors. Another major use of softwood lumber is in pallets, which make shipping and moving products easier to do. And softwood lumber is also used in the manufacturing of fiberboard and paper. So you now know everything you need to know about softwood lumber. I do want to say a couple of things just for a moment about the use of wood and why we use wood in construction. One is sustainability. Wood is 100% renewable, it is biodegradable, and it also helps and serves as insulation. Wood is durable. If properly maintained, wood structures can deliver decades and even centuries of service. And finally, the environmental footprint, important to all of us. Growing trees absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen, and also wood contributes to buildings' energy efficiency. And I wanted to present you with a specific shining example, I think, from British Columbia, and that is called the Brock Commons Building. The Brock Commons Building is at the University of British Columbia, and it's a newly built student residence at UBC, and it's made almost entirely out of timber. It is 18 stories tall. It is the world's tallest wood building. It's 162,700 square feet, and it's built by something called mass timber construction. Mass timber construction is where you take wood and you laminate it together. You either glue it together, you nail it together, you screw it together to make strong timbers. And with the exception of the first floor, which is made out of concrete, and the stairwells, which are concrete, it is an all-wood building, and it will house over 400 students. The advantage of wood is that it's sustainable and versatile building material. It stores rather than emits carbon dioxide. By using wood, the impact on this building is a reduction of 2,432 metric tons of carbon dioxide compared to other construction materials, and that's the equivalent of taking 500 cars off the road for a year. It's also significant, some of you may have heard that we think we have an election happened in British Columbia. And this building was actually referenced a number of occasions by, in particular, John Horgan, the leader from the NDP, as an example of a progressive way in which we can start utilizing wood more distinctly going forward. So what's the significance of forestry? Well, particularly for Canada. First of all, 10% of the world's forested land is in Canada. It is the third largest forested area in the world, behind Russia and Brazil. 42% of Canada's land acreage is covered by forests. 94% of Canada's forests are publicly owned. And forestry is only dealing with 1% of Canada's forests that are currently affected by logging. If you lived in a community that was surrounded by logging activity, you would be surprised by that particular statistic. The last thing is that forests remove 1/4 of all emissions from fossil fuels each year. So again, it is its significance. Why is softwood lumber significant? Canada is one of the largest lumber producers and exporters in the world. It creates thousands of jobs and contributes significantly to Canada's economy. In fact, in Canada today, although this figure is from 2015, 201,645 jobs directly related to forestry, and within British Columbia, just under 60,000 jobs are directly related to forestry. Conversely, in the United States, approximately 80% of timber production is intended for export. So obviously exports and what happens to forestry exports is significant to Canada. And this represents forestry has a revenue of $67 billion a year. I believe it's down slightly from 2015, but it's still over $60 billion. And it represents 12.5% of the manufacturing GDP in Canada. And as I mentioned, 80% of the timber production is intended for export. And interestingly, BC accounts for 61% of Canada's softwood export. Conversely, the United States is heavily dependent on the import of timber from Canada, as domestic supplies are insufficient to meet customer needs, primarily in construction. By the way, when I talk to construction people, they will say to you is that when you look at a brick house, no brick house could survive or stand without its wooden structure underneath. I was also told anecdotally that Canadian softwood lumber is preferable because Canada has, quote, harder wood. While this may be fuel for some late night comedians, I cannot say definitively that's true. Okay, so what exactly is this dispute all about? Well, first of all, the dispute is about what they call stumpage fees. It basically focuses on forestry management principles, specifically the difference in forest land ownership and timber acquisition costs, otherwise known as the stumpage rates. The stumpage rate is the price a company pays to harvest timber. As the name suggests, it was based on a price per stump at one day. However, today it's based on the volume of timber, which is measured by either cubic feet, board feet, or by weight. And here is the fundamental difference between Canada and the United States. In Canada, the forest areas are primarily owned by either the federal or provincial governments on what we now refer to as Crown land. As I mentioned before, in Canada, 94% of the forests are basically public land. In British Columbia, for example, the province leases the land to forest companies and applies stumpage rates that are determined by the provincial government. In the US, a large portion of the timber forests are in fact in private hands, in fact 70%, and the wood is sold on the market basically through buyer-seller agreements. Therefore, it leaves itself open to market fluctuations, which is part of the dilemma for the forestry industry in the United States. As a result, Canadian stumpage fees are in fact significantly lower than US prices, and I'll get into that a little more in a few minutes. The US forestry companies are arguing that this creates the equivalent of a subsidy to Canadian forestry companies, and therefore an unfair practice. Added to that, US companies are accusing Canadian forestry companies of dumping softwood lumber on the US market, And by dumping, they mean they are allegedly selling lumber at lower than the cost of production. As a result, Canadian lumber companies have acquired a larger share of the US lumber market, and Canada argues that the US claims are driven by protectionism and not about any unfair practices. So, I could spend hours talking about the history of the lumber dispute, and I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version that you can use at the dinner table. First of all, it's worth noting that the very first tariff that the United States Congress enacted was in 1789, and it was a tariff on Canadian lumber. So there is a long history here. But let's just talk about where we are today. The current dispute, if you will, really started in 1982. The US Department of Commerce investigated Canadian stumpage rates, and at that time they determined that Canada does not subsidize lumber. In 1986, another US Department of Commerce investigation, and that resulted in saying that, well, in fact, there was a subsidy, and the US imposed duties on Canadian softwood lumber. The duties were a combination of a limitation on the amount of lumber that could be shipped, but also on there was a tax that was imposed. There were a number of court cases, and in 1991, and then it ended up with Canada and the US reaching a settlement. Then in 1991, Canada ends that agreement, and the US responds by imposing duties. You may see a pattern developing here. Again, there were a number of court cases, and in 1996, Canada and US established a new 5-year agreement. In that 5-year agreement, there were taxes imposed on Canadian softwood lumber. However, there were ways of getting around those taxes, largely if Canada would impose taxes on its own lumber, and some provinces chose to do so. So, in 2001, the agreement expired, and guess what? The US imposed duties on Canadian softwood lumber. There were a number of court cases, many of which Canada won, by the way, on a technicality that I'll talk about. Until finally we reached 2006, and in 2006, a new agreement is reached, and again, primarily that had Canada taxing its own wood as a way of creating a balance. And they created basically a 10-year deal at that time. And in 2015, the agreement expired. There was a 1-year moratorium on any trade actions in 2015. And that moratorium ended in 2016. And now we find ourselves in 2017. And let's get ready to rumble. Okay, let's identify what the real issues are here. As I said, the softwood lumber agreement expired in October 2015, and what that meant was Canadian producers of softwood lumber now basically had unfettered access to the US softwood lumber market. In addition, what we've seen is an increase in Canadian ownership of US sawmills, to the point today that Canadian companies own 40 sawmills in the United States. Some of those companies, like West Fraser, actually have more sawmills in the United States, 16, than they have in Canada, 13. Another company, large company Canfor, owns 11 sawmills, which is 1 less than they have in Canada, and Interfor has 13 sawmills in the US and 5 sawmills in Canada. The growing trend of Canadian ownership of US mills is driven by the potential for obviously a labor trade conflict, also by timber availability and lower labor costs that exist in the United States. In early March 2016, Justin Trudeau and President Obama instructed their respective cabinet members responsible for international trade to explore all options for resolving the trade dispute. In fact, Chrystia Freeland, Canada's trade minister, said that we've committed to make a significant and meaningful progress towards a deal within 100 days. Obviously, that time has passed. And since October 2016, Canada has sent 10 proposals and papers to the United States, and the United States has sent 4 to Canada. In November of 2016, a leaked memo from Trump's transition team indicated that Trump was to include the softwood lumber dispute during any renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement and to get more favorable terms for the United States. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, on April 25th of this year, the Trump administration announced plans to impose duties of up to 24% on most Canadian softwood lumber, charging that the lumber companies are subsidized by the government. In response, the Canadian federal government has indicated that they're going to explore possibility of banning US coal from being exported through Canadian ports and imposing a retaliatory tariff on lumber coming from Oregon. There's an interesting issue that happens, particularly we noticed it in British Columbia, where if you go to your local Rona or hardware store and you go there to buy wood, your chances are you're buying wood that was grown in British Columbia but was milled in Oregon or Washington State and then was sent back across the border to be sold in Canada. And again, this was a key issue during our provincial election, even to the point that the then premier, and hopefully not future premier, went to say that she was going to take on Trump herself, obviously not realizing that those kind of trade deals are on the federal level, but that's okay. So there's the broad strokes. That's the overall picture, and that will give you enough to be able to engage anybody on the topic at the dinner table. But let's talk a little bit more about what this is really all about, and really trying to look at the impact by looking at British Columbia. And I want to take you to a particular spot in British Columbia, a place called Port Alberni. Beautiful spot, very picturesque, as much of British Columbia is. It's located in central Vancouver Island with a population of approximately 17,000. It's situated in the heart of what has been the richest timber stocks in British Columbia. In the 1990s, it was a thriving community largely based on the forestry industry. Since that time, sawmill production has dropped by 20%. The pulp and paper production has dropped by 57%. And the plywood plant has closed completely. Obviously, an additional result of that has been the loss of jobs, and employment in Port Alberni has dropped significantly. However, logging in that area has actually increased. There is more logging happening in Port Alberni than there has over the last 10 years. And that's increased at the same time that job growth in Port Alberni dropped by almost 5%. And oh yes, Port Alberni has one of the highest levels of child poverty in British Columbia. What the residents of Port Alberni are seeing are ships being loaded with raw logs destined to China and the US Pacific Northwest. The issue is the company that owns the mill, Western Forest Products, will not invest in upgrading the mill that's there in order to suit it for smaller diameter logs. And frankly, there's no incentive for them to do so. By the way, Western Forest Products has donated almost $400,000 to the BC Liberal Party over the last 4 years. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Okay, over the past 10 years, there have been at least 22,400 people who have lost their jobs in British Columbia, primarily in timber manufacturing. No new sawmill has been built in British Columbia in over a decade, and frankly, why would companies build new mills? In 2003, the BC Liberal government abandoned a long-standing policy that required timber companies logging trees on publicly owned or crown lands to also mill the trees in the same region, in other words, in the community where the trees are grown. Without this requirement, there is no incentive for companies to maintain mills in the area. In addition, the BC Liberals provided incentives to ship raw logs by attaching lower taxes on shipping raw logs than were on shipping finished wood products. The argument was the raw logs were deemed to be surplus. Now let's understand how a raw log becomes surplus. A raw log becomes surplus because the mill says we don't need it for our production. If you lower production, then you're going to have more logs that are created surplus, and thus the increase in raw logs. In 2016 alone, 6.3 million, get this, 6.3 million cubic meters of raw logs were shipped out of British Columbia. That, coincidentally, is a 6.3% increase from the previous year. Had those raw logs been milled in BC, it would have represented 3,650 full-time, good-paying jobs. In 2016, this meant that more than 1/3 of all the timber logged in British Columbia left the province as a raw log. That's enough wood to frame 134,000 homes, or roughly 1/2 of Vancouver's detached housing stock. In the rural communities in British Columbia, they're the ones who have paid the high social and economic costs for undervaluing what are in fact public resources. And that's where this statistic comes to play. It's interesting, during the provincial election, the BC Liberal Premier very proudly announced that British Columbia had the lowest unemployment rate of any province in Canada, which, according to Stats Canada, is actually true. But this paints a very different picture. The employment rate has been increased in British Columbia primarily in what's called the Lower Mainland, which is really Vancouver and the communities surrounding Vancouver. What has been decimated is the interior, and in particular the north of BC and most of Vancouver Island. And what we see there is job losses, communities closing, folding, and basically the economy collapsing. What we have today, and it's played out in this last provincial election. If you look at the results from the provincial election, is the NDP won most of their seats on Lower Vancouver Island and Vancouver Island and in the Lower Mainland. The Liberals won their seats in the rural areas in the north, and they based that largely on a second time around promise for job creation. The last election in 2013, the Premier won on basically an argument that by 2017 there would be 5 LNG plants producing LNG gas in British Columbia, and we would be swimming in money. It's so much so that she had started an investment fund that said this was going to have so much money and we would be able to pay for everything when this money, and oh, by the way, everyone who wanted a job was going to get a job. 4.5 years later, of course, there is not one single LNG plant in British Columbia. There's one that's been proposed, whether it will ever happen or not, and even the Premier herself would not go around and continue the lie that the promise of LNG was coming. And yet what we are left with is a fundamental rural and urban split in British Columbia, which is going to be a challenge for any government to deal with. So what's at the root of a lot of this? Well, guess what? The Wild West, that's what BC was referred to during the election period by the Globe and Mail. In 2016-17, the year and a bit leading up to the latest provincial election, the BC Liberals have raised $14 million. 52% of that money is from corporate donations, and that's not including individuals who give large donations. Over the past 10 years, 3 of the largest forestry companies are amongst the top 50 donors to the BC Liberal Party, in particular Western Forest Products, Canfor, and West Fraser. Over the same 10 years, these 3 companies have received just over $20 million worth of supply payments from the BC government. So that's the good news. What I'm going to leave you with, though, is a solution. And that there are solutions to both by the way, it's not let's get armed and go to the guns. But there are solutions to this. Solutions to both the issues that are happening in British Columbia and solutions to the current dispute with respect to softwood lumber with the United States. So let's take a look at what the solutions are. First of all, we need to reset logging rates to a sustainable level. What it means right now is that, in fact, the logging rates that exist in Canada, and in particular in British Columbia, are too high. And that's because we need to be logging fewer logs and doing a better job of reforestation. Experts have been pointing out that the program, in particular, that's used by the British Columbia government to establish logging rates is outdated, and in particular has not taken into effect climate change impacts. Now, one of the leaders in leading this fight and explaining the problem about the logging rates is a logging consultant named Martin Watts, and he came out publicly about 1.5 years ago explaining the problem with logging rates. Since he came out with that statement, Martin Watts has received no government contracts and has not been hired by any logging companies because they're telling him things. He's saying things they don't want to hear. So that's number one. Number two, increased stumpage fees. Okay, you can't share this with anybody outside this room because I'm about to tell you that Trump is right in the sense that we are providing an unfair advantage to logging companies in Canada by our low stumpage rates. Not only that, we're providing the profits of what is a public resource to private companies. Because what it allows them to do is to basically sell their wood at a lower price, still earning a very large profit, enough obviously they can make significant contributions to political parties. Let me give you an example. In 2009, the average stumpage rate for Douglas fir in British Columbia was $14.72 per cubic meter. At that time, the BC forests were suffering from the destruction of many of the usable trees through the pine mountain beetle. As a result, the BC government recalculated and created a new formula for stumpage rates, which resulted in a reduction of the stumpage rate to $1.68 per cubic meter. I'm just going to say that again for you. It went from $14.72 per cubic meter to $1.68 per cubic meter. Now, there was some rationale for that. However, and it did make some sense at the time, but the beetle problem is long past us. Today, the average stumpage rate for Douglas fir is $6.23 per cubic meter. That's less than half of the 2009 rate. And this makes no economic sense, particularly in a province where the provincial debt is frankly skyrocketing. What we're doing is taking a public resource and we're providing it to increase the profits of private corporations. Number three, establish local and regional control over logging decisions and award long-term forestry commitment that is community and job creation focused. Simply put, we should be processing logs in British Columbia, period. It maintains good paying union jobs in local communities, and it was foolish for the Liberal government in 2003 to do away with the requirement that BC timber must be processed in the communities. Number four, this one I'm going to surprise you, stop raw log exports. Under the current system, it is cost beneficial for forestry companies to ship raw logs rather than to mill them in British Columbia. And we need to turn this equation on its end. It should be costlier for companies to ship raw logs than to ship higher value products and finished woods. As I mentioned before, last year BC shipped 6.3 million cubic meters of raw logs. And had they remained and been milled in British Columbia, it would have created over 3,600 jobs. The last thing is we need to encourage new manufacturing that utilizes forest products. The provincial government should be encouraging the creation of new manufacturing enterprises that utilize wood products. This is manufacturing that is looking for milled wood, but is not directly involved in forestry. This would include manufacturing door frames, doors, window frames, building components, and, oh yes, furniture manufacturing And that's so that my daughter will have a good job when she graduates from the furniture design program at Sheridan College. So I leave you with some solutions there. And there are solutions to deal with both the softwood lumber crisis and what we're dealing with, and also to help in terms of the forestry industry. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is I want to offer a special thank you to the BC office, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, for their invaluable assistance in pulling these stats together. Thank you.
Well, my goodness, what a ton of wonderful information in a short period of time. I want to invite the three panelists to come back up, if you wouldn't mind, and make yourselves comfortable up here. That means probably moving those microphones before you sit down, because it's a chance for people to get into the discussion. And while people are getting set, I remember Elaine talked about the fact that information and studies and research are mysteriously disappearing from US government websites. The ACW has been involved in a rescue mission. We've been working with groups to get some of that information from particular agencies where there's an environmental perspective and get it out of their website and sort of store it in a safe place. So we've been contributing to the anti sort of dumping of all of that useful information, and we've been storing it. Carla can tell you more accurately how to actually access it, but do you want, maybe later when we'll just finish up the panel first, but we'll come back to that, so don't forget, don't let me forget. Now, we have three people sitting here waiting breathlessly to hear your questions, and or don't forget, you're also welcome to just offer comments on anything that they've said, which is quite a range. If you didn't, we didn't strike a chord with that range of subjects, then you might have been catching a quick nap, because there was a ton of information there. So who's first? There's mics here. If you feel up to it, you can just yell from there. Do we need? We're not recording. So if your voice carries, yes, I saw you first, please.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much for the organization of this great event, and thank you very much for the presentations. There were some things that were omitted, so I'm hoping they'll get covered by you in your wrap-up, especially on the positive side. Outside Canada, we've seen in the United States the tremendous surge of Bernie Sanders and that whole campaign, and how through the leaks we found out that the establishment of the Democratic Party made sure that he was not going to be their candidate. But that whole movement was of tremendous interest, because we all wish there was a Bernie Sanders in Canada. Similarly, we're seeing Corbyn surging ahead despite all odds, and despite the Blairite section of the Labour Party in Britain providing, again, hope to young people, to workers in that country. And in the United States itself, the tremendous strength of the $50 minimum wage campaign, which is led by women, racialized workers, etc., again, providing an example to people around the world, certainly here in Canada. And in the resistance in Canada, I wanted to talk about a couple of things. The very first talk about the rise of the allowance of fascism to rear its ugly head, small as it might be, but dangerous as it is. Tomorrow at the Tory convention, we know about Kelly Leach's message of hatred, and the people who organized the fantastic women's march here on January 21st that saw 50,000 women and allies marching are organizing a rally. You can catch a bus at Oise at 10:15 in the morning to go to the Tory convention to take on that message of hate. And also, there are small fascist groups in Canada that try to have rallies in Toronto. We've been opposing those. The next one is on June the 4th, Saturday, June 4th, at City Hall. We're talking about groups like the Soldiers of Odin, the Sons of Odin. So I think that fight back against hatred against fascism is really important. I'd like to know your thoughts on Indigenous opposition to the Trudeau pipelines. We didn't mention Trudeau and how much he has kissed up to Trump in terms of supporting the Keystone Pipeline, supporting the huge Kinder Morgan pipeline. I take encouragement from things like the LEAP manifesto and the success that the LEAP people have had in having certain NDP constituencies and labor unions supporting that. And also I take inspiration from the Green Print for Greater Toronto, organized through community groups and the Labour Council that very much focuses on just transitions, and I'd like to hear more about thoughts on just transitions for workers, especially in the fossil fuel sector. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you folks are taking notes, because that's a fair number of areas. Thank you for that. Do you want to take a 2 or 3 speakers, and then we'll do a kind of come back to you folks? Would that work? So they were taking notes in some place. I saw a hand. I think that the brother with the hat there. and then we'll come
Mine's
back.
pretty simple. My name's Stephen Such. Thank you all for your comments. If each of you, like, we have local issues, we have global issues. If each of you could change one thing, what would that be?
Choose one.
One thing, any one action, any one policy. If you had like a light switch that you're like, wow, I wish this could happen, what would that be?
Okay, I've got 2 more speakers for now, and then we'll go for 2, and then we'll do the panel, and then come back. You'll be first after that.
Answer the woman's question though first.
No, we're going to come back to that. Don't forget. We won't forget.
All right.
So please.
Canada has been the #1 industrial country in the world for the past 150 years since Confederation in 20 different categories. We have the biggest forestry logging corporation in the world. We lose more trees, hardwood and softwood, deciduous and coniferous, to forest fires than the actual harvest of the trees every year. That gives you some kind of idea or concept of how great and big this land is from sea to sea. It's kind of like a litmus test for American loggers in the States. The day Trump had put a 20% embargo on Canadian softwood, Justin Trudeau retaliated immediately in that moment, and he banned any American boat into Vancouver Harbor that had Canadian or American coal. But that has been, they have manned the amendment, and now there is Canada and the United States are the #1 trading partners in the world. Marshall, Nevada, the badge of the green footprints are found in the straw man avenues of our Harvard civilizations. The last man of the G7 Enigma and the dynasty of the asylum of our redwood matchbox civilizations. The last man to flex his muscles on unregulated nuclear war would be Donald Trump or Justin Trudeau. Per se, the evacuation of Pyongyang in 20 minutes. A canoeing script made in Canada. What is your own algebraic actuarial question you formulated from your own theses that you presented today in your presentation? The coffee making cafetiere leadership. Cafetiere in French is cafeteria, but it's also coffee maker in Quebecois French. What is your own general secrets or your own handle or Berrier or Poignay on the backbenching archetypes and axioms of this seminal seminar?
I think in fairness to the panel, I've got you next, but I'm going to ask you to hold until they've intervened, and then I'm going to come back to here, and then I've got, okay, I will take note, and there's some challenging comments in the first 3 interventions from the floor, so Elaine, do you want to go first? We'll just move across the...
Sure. Well, I wasn't planning to talk about Bernie Sanders. I certainly supported Bernie, and his campaign created a tremendous movement in the United States that continues today. One of the things he did, which maybe in Canada we're used to the term socialism. It doesn't, freak too many people out. In the U.S., there's a whole generation that, my generation, the baby boomers who are, my American colleagues are still very nervous about socialism. And one of the things about Bernie's campaign was it showed that there's a whole new generation that not only isn't the least bit frightened by the term, but think, well, neat idea. What would it look like? Why not? And that was very exciting. The other thing is his campaign always, he did two things at every one of his meetings. One is he brought forward workers from a local campaign. So it may have been Fight for 15, it may have been, a local strike or something. Always brought workers on some campaign. Secondly, always had somebody speak about the environment and the environment campaign in the local area and nationally. Did that in every campaign stop. A weakness is at the beginning. I don't think he fully appreciated, while he has been somebody who certainly supported the civil rights movement, how much racism was part of the anti-Obama movement. And later he came to recognize that it needed to do a lot more on that issue, and I think our revolution is starting to do it. One point that I didn't mention that is very important, which is that one of the moves we're expecting shortly is to declare, probably through the Supreme Court, business wants to claim that NGOs, non-government organizations, community groups, and worker centers that support workers, by their behavior, are in fact labor organizations, and therefore must fall under labor regulation in the United States, meaning the national LMRA, which is a piece of legislation that requires unbelievable reporting procedures, et cetera. And it's really administrative harassment, and I think that would destroy worker centers, and that's probably why they'll attempt to do that. And that leads nicely to the brother who asked about, I love that, one policy. I think in the labor area, I probably am different than a lot of people, but I think if we got rid of probably the National Labor Relations Act and all labor legislation in the United States, it would be helpful. I know that sounds terrible and awful, except it has all become the opposite of what it was intended. And the federal preemption has now become a barrier to states being able to pass progressive labor legislation. So it might be a moment where, considering getting rid of the federal preemption, which is a little less radical than getting rid of the National Labor Relations Act, but if we got rid of the federal preemption, you would have model labor legislation in California, in New York, and for all my friends who would say, but it would be awful in Louisiana. Get over it. It is awful in Louisiana. It is less than 3% in South Carolina. So I'm not worried that it would get worse in those states. And more important, we would be able to show a different way of doing things. So.
Thank you.
And am I on? Okay. And I'm going to riff off what Elaine just said and answer the question about the one policy change. And that is create policy or change policy that stops inhibiting labor unions from being able to function. I don't think it is accidental or the fact that we have to look back to Ronald Reagan's presidency, who, by the way, a lot of people forget, his slogan during his campaign was "Make America Great Again." And he basically took full-on attack the labor unions. And frankly, the labor movement has not recuperated from that. And I think it's been not as significant in Canada, but it has been significant. I don't think that it's, I think the fact of the matter is that labor unions, while believe me, not perfect, still, you can look at any society, any community, and where there are strong labor unions, there are better human rights, there are better working conditions, there are better living conditions than in those that aren't. So I would say if it were policy, that's the first thing I would look at. Something that either takes the shackles off labor unions or policy that's proactive to make things easier. I want to go back to the point that was raised earlier, and one of the issues that, you're right, we haven't talked about here, and that's particularly about, although I talked about forestry as a resources, but I think about what's happening with respect to issues like Kinder Morgan and fracking and everything that's happening around that. And what's been interesting, and I have to apologize, and I think the other people in the room are from British Columbia. We have been so immersed in this election for the last 2 months and all the details and the nuances of it, and it's still not over. But one of the key things that's come out of that is that we now have the majority of voters, I would argue 60% of the voters in British Columbia voted for political parties that oppose Kinder Morgan, that oppose continuing moving towards carbon fuels, and is looking towards some real solutions. So I think that's a really positive step. How that will all play out over the next few days and weeks is hard to tell, but I think it's something to a good starting point and something that we can move forward with.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep my remarks very brief. The simple or straightforward question that I should deal with first is from the gentleman there as to if I had an opportunity, what policy would I enact? I don't think there's any doubt in my mind, given my political perspective at present, and that is to get big money out of politics. I mean, I think it's not only poisoned almost irreparably the American political system, but it still intrudes in the Canadian system in I think in an awful, unfortunate way, and it just doesn't serve anyone's interests except the moneyed interests, and it's something that I think needs to happen. More broadly, and if I can make reference to the lady's kind of your comment about various examples of resistance, which I found very interesting, I think very persuasive, and it's something that we need to be reminded about. I think an issue that really has troubled me for the last many months or a couple of years is the question that why do people in so many voting situations, whether it's the US or whether it's the UK, in Canada, elsewhere in parts of Europe, why do they vote against their own self-interest, their own interests? And quite frankly, I haven't come up with an answer, because certainly a universal answer. I think of it every time Trump parades the working class people in Pennsylvania or whatever that voted for him for reasons which were clearly dishonest. And when one sees when one sees the damage that so many of Trump's policies will do, are doing to the very people that voted for him. I'm not talking about the rabid right-wingers, I'm talking about working class people. It mystifies me a bit. I mean, I think that the Bernie Sanders kind of experience, I must say, took me by surprise, because although I'm a Canadian observing the US, I've had much experience in the US, and I think, like all of us, we're familiar with this socialism problem in the US, but clearly there was a lot of support for what Sanders stood for. And I think one heartening thing in terms of the next go-around, if not the congressional elections next year, certainly 2020, if God forbid Trump runs for re-election, is the fact that there seem to be several potential Democratic candidates, not only Sanders, of kind of a center-left, left-liberal, of that side of the spectrum, well left of kind of the Clinton crowd that most of them relatively, apart from Warren, most of them relatively unknown to most people probably at this stage, but that's not unusual. So I think it would be interesting to see whether there's a new candidate that might double it. Because if you asked me, would Bernie Sanders win in 2020? I mean, let's look at the man's age and look at the experience last time. I think the answer is no. And I think that at the end of the day, we've got to be kind of cold-blooded and laser-focused about what can win and what can't. You mentioned, for example, that Corbyn is raging ahead. Well, Corbyn is probably going to lose in a landslide to Theresa May. He may be pulling ahead somewhat, kind of post the Manchester, but that's essentially a rigged system in the UK and a rather loathsome government. You know, the Conservative government is going to walk away probably with a landslide victory. So I think people of the left in Britain have got to actually look at those results and look at themselves in the face and say, how can we do better? And I'm not quite sure whether a Sanders in 2020 or a Corbyn in 2017 is quite the trick here.
Folks, I have an apology to make. I got so engrossed in the first round of questions that I forgot to look at my watch. We're over time now, and we actually have some treats outside. There's coffee, and I don't know if there's food, lots of food. So I tell you what, these folks are probably going to be having a bite to eat, and if you've got questions, you probably can, or comments, you can probably catch them. But in fairness to everybody, you folks included, some of you have other commitments for the evening. We do really need to wrap up. Let me just suggest that we thank our panel for an extraordinary afternoon of information. Carla, is it, it's out in the lobby, sir?
It's out, and I think it's to the left.
Okay, I think you probably came by a kind of lobby area. There's going to be food and snacks and probably chocolate, maybe Belgian chocolate.
Okay. Well, I tell you, great, thanks. So we've been winning on the technicality. That's the sense, right? So the reality is what we need, we've been actually robbing ourselves, right? In our voices of public resource. What we should be doing is we should be charging a fair sum. If we were charging a fair sum, there would be no argument.
Yeah, well, that's always the argument that I've already made, but it still runs into the problem of this is going to be a very visceral kind of negotiation, because on the Canadian side, people want the Canadian for the position, without Canadian the position based on tax.
But you want to grab the money? That's right. And then the laptop. No, but that's exactly it, and that's the dilemma. The way it's being presented and what the real solution is.
Anyway, I know, I think it's the direction we need to move in, is, yeah, I mean, you can build and increase the market. Yeah.
Especially because they
Yeah,
get
exactly.
the population is.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Good.
Yeah, you do. Hey.
Hey.
Oh, hey. Hey, Anna. How are you? Good. How are you? Good. Do you just take? Is that a nail biter? Yeah, it was on your dad. No. When we were sitting together, it was like, good job. My dad was a preacher. Oh.
Oh.
So that's why I always thought that was enough. Like in the pulpit, I just don't see something that's going to carry. Yeah. Jeez. No, I think he did a great job. Difficult job. Yeah. So what do you guys have to do?
Nothing right now.
Well, I did, but I think. I mean, just
Well-
signed up as I gotta go up there, so.
Okay. So what I thought we'd do is, we should get out of here. I've got a car.
Oh, hey.
So, so we should get out of here, go walk, we need to walk kind of the dog. And then after we walk kind of the dog, then we go.
Yeah, sounds good. If you guys drop me off, I can do that. We can go after.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just gonna take them off.
You want to suggest something?
Yeah.
Yes, for both.
Okay.
Should be someplace.
For one night. Although I did take the reindeers. He's water scare. Let's go and all.
Okay. Well, get some rid of this. You ever done this?
No.
Okay. I mean, it's not. Yeah. Yeah, I have the old one. Oh, you can wheel that. You know what it's doing, right?
Sorry, what's that?
The whole podium. It's right there. Okay. No, it's okay. All good. You're close.
Oh, there it is.
So I would have it sort of the open side facing out, gravel stuff. And then I'm gonna bring everything up. I don't know why I told you not to bring your key down.
Sorry?
I don't know why I told you not to bring your key down. Totally made sense.
I'll salad? Well, I should have it on me anyway. I should know better.